In AP Seminar, each of the assessment tasks focuses on a set of proficiencies, or groups of learning objectives, that students should be able to demonstrate. The individual written argument focuses on understanding and analysing context and perspective, establishing argument, selecting and using evidence, and applying conventions, or citation and writing appropriate to an academic report. There are 7 rows in the IWA rubric, and you can see in the first column that each row is linked to a proficiency, which is its overall focus. Each row is scored separately as it evaluates different qualities of the essay. In each row, there are different levels of performance with a description of what typically you see in student work at that level. Rows 1 and 2 are simply binary. The choice you are making here is whether or not the response meets the threshold described. If it does, it scores 5 points. If not, it scores 0. Rows 3 to 7 have 2 levels of performance that you can award points for, and a descriptor for what doesn't get into the points range for that row. So you can think of this as low, medium and high. When you're scoring, you need to be looking for best fit. That is, you need to assign the score with the description that best fits that student's response. The descriptions are not of the minimum performance for that level. Sometimes you'll see that there can be quite a range of performance within a level. Not all low scoring samples look the same, for example. Different rows have different points values allocated to them in order to differentiate between their weighting, or in other words, their relative importance to the task. You'll notice that Establish Argument, row 4, has the highest weighting. You can only allocate the points values that you see on the rubric. In-between values are not allowed. For example, in row 3, you can only award 9 points, 6 points, or 0 points, and nothing in between. Before moving on, take a minute to download the IWA rubric and scoring notes. You may want to print these out to have them in front of you as reference as we work through the samples. For each row, try and summarise in no more than 3 to 4 words the focus for that row. Before we look at the training samples for IWA, let's just take a look at the instructions on the first page of the rubric and scoring notes, shown here. As we discussed in the previous presentation, it's important that students make use of the stimulus materials when choosing their area of inquiry, and not just write an essay on an unrelated topic that they'd already decided they wanted to write about. The instructions talk about responses that are considered off-topic. These are responses that do not meet the basic requirement of the task, that is, to use the stimulus material as a basis for developing a research question, and then develop an evidence-based argument based on that research. If you cannot see how the subject matter of the essay in any way links with the stimulus materials, then it could be identified as off-topic. While the stimulus packet is united by a prevailing theme, a student may find a connection between 2 sources that does not necessarily fall under the purview of that overall theme. This is okay. However, if you have to work for longer than 10 seconds to discern what relation the response has to a theme uniting 2 or more sources, it's likely that it's contrived or absent, and so will score 0. Note that this decision is separate to the integration of one of the stimulus materials into the argument, which is scored in row 1 of the rubric. This is like a basic check that the response is actually doing the required task before it is scored. Take a look at the example, opioid crisis. This response was deemed off-topic as there's no discernible connection to a theme relating to the stimulus materials. While the response does mention work in its introduction, it says, "So, how does America affect the working class citizen with a history of opioid abuse? Mainly, how does an opioid abuse problem affect a working class American financially?" It does not engage in a discussion of these questions for the remainder of the response. Instead, the response outlines ways that different communities, for example Native Americans, are affected by the opioid crisis. The response also briefly mentions job loss on page 3, but it's not at all central to the response's point in that paragraph, let alone its argument. Therefore, the response received a 0 in all rubric rows. So, it's important that when your students are developing their research questions, they draw on the analysis of the stimulus materials. Before you move on, download and read through the 4 training samples. You don't need to try and score them, but it will help your understanding in the next activities where these will be used to exemplify points about the rubric.